Oh, I am so excited. I just had to make another video. Sorry about all the flooding of videos. There's this really great conversation going on between Cimbolic and Veritas 48 on the presumption of atheism. Moving along. And the link is in the sidebar. Now, what's that about? Well, it started sort of as, just a little bantering about, is the absence of evidence about God the evidence of absence? And so Cimbolic came up with 9 gorgeous criteria about what would constitute the evidence of absence of God. But in so doing, he came up with a lot more than what he thought he was coming up with. See, he's smarter, he's really just, can't say enough good things about him. Okay. These 9 criteria are absolutely excellent for detecting God's existence. And I don't know how the philosophers for the last 200 years missed it, but if they're staring down from heaven or up from hell, they must be panting with jealousy over how good this is. So I'm going to read the 9 criteria to you. I verified that I heard him correctly with Cimbolic, but I'm going to read them to you kind of in a different order than he presented them in his videos, and you're going to find out why as I go along, okay? So, if you get bored, just turn this off. Alright, here's my list. This is so good. This is even better than the best dish I can make of food. I mean, this is even better than chili. Alright, or pick your favorite food. Okay. The 9th criterion that he listed is where you want to start in your detecting God thingy, if you want to do this at all. Okay? Number 9 was, he's quoting Sherlock Holmes, he's being kind of facetious, he said, if every other explanation has proven impossible, then the only remaining one, however implausible, is correct. That's where you start. Because number 1 of his list of criteria was, evidence of the absence would be proven if something you know and can recognize isn't there. Okay, well, when you're talking about invisible God, alright, and I'll explain why I'm saying it that way in a minute. If you're talking about invisible God, then you have to determine what God's face looks like. Because in his example, it was John in a restaurant. He knew what John's face looked like, and he didn't see John there, so John wasn't there. Okay? So how do you know if God is there in the restaurant of life? Okay? Well, start with number 9. You gotta pick the most implausible idea of God. Pick the most implausible idea of God. Now you're going to have an idea of what that is, and I'm going to suggest one to you also. And plot out, write on a piece of paper, what the characteristics would have to be. That will be your number 1 in something you know and can recognize, because what you're doing is you're like sitting in the police station where you're describing the assailant's characteristic to a criminal artist, and he's trying to draw the criminal out for you. So now we want to determine if God is guilty of existence. Okay, so, but the fastest way to do this is to first pick a definition of God that is the most implausible, the most ludicrous, the one that makes the least amount of sense. Now, all the ideas about God come in 2 flavors. They are absolute or they're relative. Okay? Absolute or relative. The relative gods are like, the Greek myths, Greek pantheon, Roman myths, blah, blah, blah. Some kind of polytheistic conglomeration. There's a bazillion of those. You'd be chasing your tail forever if you did that. But the most implausible idea of God that least accords with the evidence, that is hardest to detect with most absence, will be an invisible, absolute God. It just so happens that this concept of an absolute invisible God is all over the planet. It's called monotheism, okay, in various forms. Okay, I think monotheism is a misnomer when it comes to Christianity, but that's beside the point. An absolute God. If God is absolute, then all of your relative systems by themselves do not serve to detect absoluteness. Because absoluteness, number one, would be immaterial. Because absoluteness, number two, would be a stasis. See, I'm coming up with characteristics. And then, of course, once you start getting into very commonly known ideas about God, you got righteousness, justice, truth, love. Okay, absolute God would be non-spatial. So there would be no evidence like you would have about evidence of a John in a restaurant. So that's the most implausible. That's also the strongest idea of God. So now we get into the military strategy of doing this. If you hit your enemy at his strongest point and win, then all the weaker ideas, they topple. So your task would be going straight to the jugular, going for the absolute God idea. One absolute God. Now, it might be more than one, because once you get into the concept of absoluteness, you realize, oh boy, absoluteness is qualitative, not quantitative. It's non-spatial, it's non-time, it's a stasis. It's a character. It's a character. A character that just always is. Okay, but if you could shoot down the existence of that character, then you don't have to mess with any lesser ideas of God, because they're, or you could if you wanted to, but it would be a piece of cake after that. This is the hard one to prove, and it's the most implausible. So, if it remains, and you go through all his 8 points, then you come back to the 9th because that was your starting point, oh, baby, then you've really got something. So, start with the most implausible idea of God, number 9, and see if it's still standing at the end of your analysis. And absolute God is the most implausible because there's like almost no evidence in our relative, physical, time-centered, limited world. What evidence is there of an absolute God? Okay, so then you sit down and say, okay, what does absolute God mean? Well, timeless, spaceless, absolute love, uh-oh. Absolute truth, uh-oh. Absolute righteousness, and then we have to say something like omnipresent, although it's absolute existence, above, it would be more like every other thing would be inside, so to speak. This character, rather than the other way around. But as a matter of accommodation, you say God is omnipresent, God is everywhere. Omniscient, that includes all the what ifs and all the what not ifs, all the what's possible, what's not possible, and it especially includes the character being that way. If God is truth, and God can make truth be anything He wants, uh-oh. Because that would mean that everything that exists is dependent on whatever this God decrees as truth. And there are a lot of things in this world that aren't very pleasant, so why would God make it be so? That's a quandary, isn't it?